the Socialist Workers' Party. The meeting that you've come to now is Revolutionary Environmentalism from Below. Our speaker is Rappel, who's a Marxist ecologist from Wales, and he's part of the Land Workers Alliance. Ian's going to speak for half an hour. After that, it's over to you for discussion and debate, and then Ian will come back. So, Ian, over to you.
Right. Can you all hear me? So, is someone saying no? Can you all hear me? Yeah. If I project like that, is it all right? Yeah. Right. I'll do my best, Richard Burton. Good afternoon, all. Thank you very much for coming. There's a couple of things to say before we start, apart from making sure you can all hear me. The first is that this meeting comes from a conversation that I started with the late, great John Morley. So this meeting goes out to John, really, with appreciation for all of the work that he did around the environment. So thanks, John, and hopefully apologies for any errors forced by the incompleteness of those conversations. But it's also a bit personal. I came to revolutionary socialism through environmentalism. And that journey informs some of what I have to say in the meeting, and will necessarily involve some anecdotes of that experience. Because that journey, I think, was useful. I hope so, anyway. I'm reading from a laptop. I'm sorry, I couldn't get a printer. It means this meeting has a higher carbon intensity than I hoped. But I have been told that the battery will last for 5.5 hours, so we won't quite make it, but we'll go. Now, this meeting doesn't deal in detail with the environmental crises that capitalism has ushered in. And the ones we know about, climate change, pollution, species loss, and those sorts of things, let alone the ones that are to come. I'm not talking about the environmental crises per se. It starts from the position that these crises are real, and that individually and cumulatively they threaten to, at very best, disrupt what we might call human civilization. Although we might have to define that quite loosely, given the barbarism that's washing over us at the moment. If these issues are allowed to increase in severity, as the ruling class is evidently happy for them to do, then they would play important roles in either revolutionary change, from dual power to dictatorship of proletariat and on into the foothills of global socialism, or they would play an important part in the common ruination of the contending classes, as Marx and Engels argue.
Speak up just a bit.
I will, yes. My God. Excuse me. Is it a microphone?
It is.
I have a mic. Never put a microphone in front of a Welshman. Means I'm going to sing. Right. Can you hear me now? Yeah. These challenges are bad enough when we take them separately. Things like biodiversity loss, climate change, cumulatively, which is how we ought to see them, because they're about ecology in the round. They are making the Anthropocene, this period of geological time that we're in, almost completely destructive, and it's a geological era that has very few precedents in human history, none, and even in the geological record. There's a few episodes of mass extinction, but the activities of the capitalist system and how it's operating on the planet's ecology is on par with that. So we're living through a moment of mass extinction that will have geological implications, whether we divert it or not. But obviously, it's the need to divert it. The meeting also seems that many of the solutions to our environmental crises are well known and are actually being practiced in some instances. The solutions are already out there at one level. Things like agroecology, renewable energy, convivial conservation. They're seen as unprofitable, and they therefore exist in the cracks of the corrupting capitalist system and not at scale sufficient to cope with the rates of degradation being unleashed by the system, let alone halt or reverse this trend. But we know they're out there. We know they're out there, and there's much more to discover. Now, we may want to discuss the crisis in more detail in the contributions, and that's okay. But for the next 20 minutes or so, what I want to do is focus on the political response to the ecological crisis. And that political response is called environmentalism. Talk about what it is, what it isn't, why it's important, how we can interpret it, how it's struggled with reformism and liberalism, and why the role of revolutionaries is or should be critical, and how environmentalism as a contribution to the self-emancipation of the exploited classes, especially the working class, is really important. At the end of the sort of quarter of an hour or so, I'll make some suggestions, some based on my own experience, on how we as revolutionary socialists and other revolutionaries, there's others in the room, can influence mainstream environmental campaigns to help secure important and enduring victories for ecological sanity from local to the global levels. We'll start with a couple of quotes, so if you don't mind, indulge me. The first is from Roger Hallam. Roger Hallam is the founder of Extinction Rebellion, or certainly one of the leadership. He's still languishing in jail for basically chatting about disrupting a motorway. And this is from his first major piece for The Ecologist magazine, the online platform anyway, after his incarceration. And this is what Roger Hallam has to say. At some point in the next few years, the climate will have a moment of whirlwind. It's George Floyd moment, it's Gaza moment. Except this time, many more millions of people will be on the streets of Western cities because thousands of people, white people that is, will be killed. The repression overnight will turn to rage, and no one is going to give a ruck about risking arrest. The spirit of Nietzsche will take over from the spirit of Bentham. Life is for living, not being wise. Bourgeoisie colonization of our minds will be conquered. History will be back on the move. In the meantime, it's a matter of focusing on the job, what we can change. We must create systemic mobilization, mass train people in organizational leadership. Most of all, we will create a genuine counter-ideology, one that takes joy in struggle, celebrates the community of resistance, and lays down the plans for what comes next after the inevitable revolutions to come. Hallam's words are useful, partly because they explicitly raise the issue of revolutionary change, and he is very serious about that if you read his other work, even if it's a bit vague or kind of post-modern on the agency. And it reveals a state of mind that's probably or possibly shared by millions in the West who've engaged in environmental struggles. As far back as the 90s and beyond, back into the 1960s. Although you will notice from a lot of their literature they prefer the term social transformation to revolutionary change. Now, Hallam highlights the fact that the climate crisis is already here. The movement in environmentalism often makes references to future generations, and that's still very relevant. But the generations have arrived. They're here. My daughter is 9. Most of the changes that we're facing will take place in her life. So those future generations have arrived. He has a revolutionary response to the unfolding catastrophe, and his arguments make an important reference to the West, the region of the world that has been the source of modern and liberal mainstream environmentalism. And we'll return to his view, I guess, on the inevitability of revolution later on, but it is an important response. The next quote comes from a lovely little book, which I recommend, called A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, by Catherine Youssef, who has got the wonderful job title, Professor of Inhuman Geography at Queen Mary University of London. Really, really nicely and tightly argued book about perspectives on the Anthropocene seen from history of colonialism. So I'll read a little quote from this. Put the glasses off for a moment. If the Anthropocene proclaims a sudden concern with the exposures of environmental harm to white liberal communities, it does so in the wake of histories in which these harms have been knowingly exported to black and brown communities under the rubric of civilization, progress, modernization, and capitalism. The Anthropocene might seem to offer a dystopic future that laments the end of the world, but imperialism and ongoing settler colonialisms have been ending worlds for as long as they've been in existence. The Anthropocene, as a politically infused geology and scientific popular discourse, is just now noticing the extinction it has chosen to continually overlook in the making of its modernity and freedom. So I think that's a really important argument. And it's a really important argument in which we can frame or reframe what we mean by environmentalism. It brings to the surface quite an important truism for us when we think about environmental struggles. Most of the struggles against colonialism, neo-colonialism, neoliberalism could and should be framed as environmental. They're not just struggles in sort of political sense, they have that environmental element to them. They're class-based struggles against imperialist resource exploitation and the environmental impacts of such on health and the socio-ecological fabrics of the cultures and societies that they've impacted. To paraphrase the US activist and academic Ashley Dawson, we might be excited by direct action as a tool for the climate struggle, and it's very topical at the moment, but the people of the global south have been blowing up pipelines for generations. It's really important that we broaden our environmental concerns in that way. Forwards to include the outcomes and the need for transformation, and backwards to view history as a struggle for nature, as well as human liberation from class society. And then we can look at the definition of environmentalism itself. Now, to give you an example, we can look, once we accept that kind of broader term, at the meetings that take place at the same time as this one. This is a meeting on the environment. Read back to the list of the other meetings that are taking place at other comrades elsewhere today at this moment. LA uprisings, protests, the US left with the power to stop Trump. Absolutely environmental. Trump is trying to shred the environment in the US through every action. Alienation, what's the point of it all? A large part of the entire problem we have with ecology is our alienation from it, from the world. The politics of Lenin, a great deal to say there. Democratic centralism alone as the means of forging environmental response should be explored and taken seriously. Class or community, what gives us power? A vitally important question. A lot of the environmental problems as they roll out across the working class in this country roll out at the community level. You know, the destruction of your parks, your green spaces, housing being built on floodplains, those sorts of things. Crucial. Revolutionary environmental policy. The family through the ages. And again, a really important area. One of the challenges we face over time has been demographic. The nature and the changing nature of the family has affected total fertility rates as long as capitalism has been in place. And it's not to say that population growth is the overriding problem or anything like that, but we mustn't deny that it's an issue. But look at where it's located. Located at household security level. Okay? So there we are. We could have run a whole of Marxism as an environmental conference, and it would still be permanent and still be relevant. And the importance of making an argument is, I listened to James Medway in the opening sessions around neoliberalism, and he said, oh, what the left needs to do next. Sorry, James. What the left needs to do next is to connect environmental struggle to traditional left struggle. It's there already. It's there already. It needs to be teased out and made explicit, and we need to connect with those environmental struggles. I feel a bit passionate about that, you can tell. Well, what's environmentalism? Environmentalism is the politics of human ecology. That's what it is. It may present itself as a conviction or an ideology that resources are finite, and that the earth is not an infinite garbage can. That's paraphrasing Chomsky. But that frame of reference is set by the most destructive form of society that humanity has created, which is capitalism. In other words, at the moment, environmentalism is the politics against the system. critique, really important critique, and struggles to provide visions and alternatives to socioecology. To reluctantly use a petrochemical analogy, environmentalism at the moment is about slamming on the brakes rather than changing the gear. It focuses on the planet and the non-human world, but even where it orientates itself around the defense of nature or wilderness, with wide range of methodologies, vary from preservationism at the Sierra level of the National Trust, to polite lobbying of politicians and corporations, to the direct action tactics of Greenpeace, Sea Shepherd Foundation, and Extinction Rebellion to stop oil. Even where its simple solutions envisage a separation between humanity and nature, like the half-Earth paradigm, it's fundamentally about humanity. It's about what David Harvey says. All critical examinations of the human relation to nature are simultaneously critical examinations of society. You can't separate the environment out. If we do, it causes us problems. Well, what's the roots of environmentalism? On that broader definition I laid out, environmentalism in some form or other is probably as old as class society. As ruling elites took over land and pushed other classes into different positions, some of the expression of the struggle would have been ecological. So it's got that. It's certainly one of the defining elements of historic struggles against colonialism, neo-colonialism, and imperialism. And that's not to say that the political responses reflect the actual ecological conditions. Capitalism has always been ecocidal. And that's what's behind the metabolic rift, or it's certainly how the metabolic rift expresses. But the political response to environmentalism sharpens and goes up and down. In the form that we now associate it, mainstream environmentalism starts, like so many other modern struggles, in the 1960s, and is a very specific output of the American War in Vietnam. World War II preceded that, War of the Factories, as Stalin called it, led to massive ecological upheaval, shift towards fossil fuels across every element of capitalist and state capitalist economies, from transport to farming. The post-war capitalist stability and the boom saw huge growth, economic growth, but it came at a growing ecological cost. By the time we get to the 1960s, you can start to see that play out ecologically. So, anybody read Silent Spring by Richard Carson? Yeah? Okay, so 1962, Richard Carson, a very principled ecologist, noticed that the chemicals that were being used to support intensive agriculture were starting to build up in the food chain, DDT in particular. And the very real danger was that as toxins build up in the food chain, they concentrate at the top levels of the food chain, the apex predators and those sorts of things. So what was being noticed was that the bird populations were starting to collapse. Partly because DDT was affecting the thickness of the shells on the eggs. So they were crushing their own eggs. So there was that very real example. There was also a growing awareness of the consequences, if you like, of laissez-faire industrialization, commercial whaling, nuclear power, pollution like acid rain, those sorts of things. In the 60s, you started to see this groundswell in the West of concern around environmental issues. Added to that, we also saw the consequences of specific imperialist strategies. Agent Orange and napalm use in Vietnam. So you saw this sort of radicalization that came in the 60s around the war, and that started to express itself in the environmental arena. So a bunch of draft dodgers from the Vietnam War headed to Canada and pushed their politics into environmental studies, and that's what started Greenpeace. That's where Greenpeace came. It's also where Friends of the Earth started. The trouble with environmentalism is it feels sort of cycle. It goes up and it goes down. So that kind of 60s environmentalism, there were some notable successes, and then there was a kind of hiatus, a collapse, and then it came back again in the late 1980s, 1990s, and then dissipated again, came up again. So that it's got this sort of cyclical phasing. Michael Allenby, biologist, had said that the environment is like sex. Every generation thinks they invented it. Good way of putting it. But what I suspect what it is that it sort of shadows the crisis in the capitalist system itself. But why is the situation worse now? Even though we've had environmentalism since the 1960s, even though it predates that, even though in the broader context we can see other struggles in environmental, how have we got this contradiction that there are more members of environmental organisations now than there's ever been, and yet the condition of the environment is worse? What is it about the efficiency, the efficacy, and the effectiveness of those struggles that's causing problems? Why is the actual situation, why does it match public consciousness and public passion? So I'm just going to give you a small example and we'll go through that. In 1992 there was something called the Earth Conference. Anybody old enough to remember? Yeah. Okay, so there was, at the end of the Cold War, there was a coming together. There was the idea that the Soviet Union was an environmental disaster, and there was this idea that climate change was starting to be seen. It's called the greenhouse effect then, if you remember. And that what the world needed to do was come together. So they came together at the United Nations at the Earth Conference, and they said, well, we'll solve all the problems. George Bush Sr. said, anybody who's afraid of the greenhouse effect needs to remember the White House effect. Yeah, it is true. We're not knowing that he meant it. It's better than Ronald Reagan, who said, I think 90% of pollution is caused by flowers and trees. Anyway, we're back with Trump, and there's going to be something crazy on that. But 1992, massive explosion of environmental awareness, and great big agreements at the United Nations. Okay, on all sorts of things, conventions on biodiversity, climate change, and all sorts of things. By 1999, the optimism that had come with that completely dissipated, and had been replaced with anti-capitalism, very serious anti-capitalism that had the environment within it. Because what was being seen was that the distance between the words of the United Nations and the reformers and the liberals associated with it, and the deeds that were taking place on the ground, the gap was very big. So there was this bottom-up struggle that came through anti-capitalist movement, and the environment was very much part of that. We then had the war on terror and the retreat of that, and the retreat of environmentalism as well in that context. So that by the time we had the Rio conferences, or the Rio Plus 20 conferences in 2012, neoliberalism had more or less cornered all of the environmental solutions. And if you attempted at that point to say that it was down to corporations and those sorts of things, you were seen as a radical, and that the mainstream was going to be able to deal through conventions of the parties, all these sorts of things. The kind of reformist liberal idea that all you needed was international agreements that people signed up to, money provided from the World Bank and those sorts of things, and everything would be fine. And it's not the case. It just has got worse since then. I've written too much and I'm running out of time. I'll come back to some stuff. One of the issues is the kind of the dominance of liberalism within environmental movement. It's, if you like, the way in which mainstream environmentalism has sought credibility with the political class. It's focused its arguments on speaking truth unto power, that sort of Quakerism, and it's organised itself and strategies around that. Even to the degree where it's offered to financialise nature, to help leaders understand, the impact of capitalism. All you have to do is have a money equivalent to nature. They call it natural capital accounting. And all you need to do then is set up markets and exchange and offsetting and all those sorts of things. The clue in the problem is the word offsetting. Offsetting is not behavioural change. Offsetting is compensation for carrying on in that behaviour. And we now have a situation where most mainstream environmentalism is dominated by that kind of, it is a sort of neoliberal discourse. Privatise everything, including nature, and everything will be fine. So that's the situation we face, and what we need to do is think of the alternative. And the alternative is from below. The alternative is around similar sort of things that we saw with the anti-capitalist. A groundswell of resistance. Learning, as I said, from the global south struggle, environmental struggle for life. Learning those lessons ourselves. 5 minutes. Right, let's go straight to, well, let's sum up what different environmentalisms are out there that are causing the problems. The first one we could describe as authoritarian environmentalism. The idea that humanity needs to be controlled, and we are fundamentally a problem. I would call that pessimism of the intellect, optimism of Armageddon in some cases. And some people seem to be happy for us to be wiped off the planet. And possibly fascism too. The idea that the only way to solve the problems is greater authoritarianism. Then there's liberal mainstream environmentalism. Pessimism of the intellect again. Optimism of the United Nations and the market system. Faith in the infrastructure, the global infrastructure of economics, and the United Nations system will save us. Then there's lifestyle environmentalism. Pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the farmer's market. Okay, the idea that you, through your individual actions, changes in your diet on your own, has a cumulative effect on these impacts. I'm not saying that lifestyle changes are not important. In many cases, it's the first step, the first important step to environmental consciousness. But it's not a solution. And what we have to offer in response to all of those kind of environmentalisms is, if you like, radical and revolutionary environmentalism. That's pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of human agency and class struggle. I just want to finish by saying what that could mean. If we look at what's going on the ground away from those big United Nations agreements and those sorts of things, environmental activities from below are amazing. A very good book by somebody called Ashley Dawson called Environmentalism from Below. There is community and workplace environmental activism taking place everywhere, all over the world, in all environments, urban, rural, from community renewable energy projects to agroecology, and on into radical conservation ideas that are arguing against the elitist separation between ourselves and environmental solutions and nature. And they need to be joined up. Almost like ecology itself, there needs to be a kind of ecology of those activities. They need to be linked and overlapped, and the fact that they're mutually reinforcing needs to be brought to the surface. A lot of those things, those activities are not waiting for the state to act, and don't have any faith in policies and conventions in the mainstream. They're actively challenging the status quo, and they're pushing for solutions as well as alternative visions. What they lack is a revolutionary core. And that, comrades, is where our tradition comes in. So the question then becomes, well, how can we embed the environment into our traditional campaigns and working class agitation? There are some people doing some great work on this. It's Karen Bell, who's written a really good book on working class environmentalism. There will be sessions elsewhere in Marxism that talk about common sense. And what kind of strategies can you as revolutionaries do? As all of us do, I suppose. Well, let's pick a nice, easy example, the weather. The advantage of British culture, right, is that we're always talking about weather. On a picket line or on a stall or on any demonstration where there's a component of the size and success of those things in Britain. Poor weather notoriously has the democratic disillusionment at the polls. If it's raining, you get a lower turnout. Tells you more about the political system than it's about the weather and the availability of umbrellas. Under climate change, what we're seeing, it is only a short step when you're having conversations in those environments for us to go from polite discourse over the weather to very sharp debates and discourse about how it's becoming more extreme,
and how that impacts people's work lives and communities. And crucially, why capitalists are making money from that misery by continuing fossil fuel extraction and failing to engineer the social and ecological initiatives necessary for us to cope. Now, at the core of our revolutionary approach, I suppose, there are a number of values that we need to bear in mind and bring into those environmental debates. First is an absolute rejection of fatalism. And here I'm grateful to John Olney. We can also find it in the work of others like John Berger. The capitalist system is strong, is powerful, but there's always space. And history is a series of presents. The second is self-emancipation, self-worth and self-confidence. Workers are already striving to improve their own environments, from feeding birds at the bird table to having indoor plants. These are important things. These are acts that tend to connect with nature. The second one is political principles with coherent positions. Don't sell out. Don't sell out. It's a really important revolutionary principle. And it's important because it will counter that kind of mainstream environmentalism that takes these huge memberships of environmental organisations and sells them down the river by working with corporates on offsetting. Don't sell out. The policies are important, but they're not enough. They need to be defended and extended. And then the final thing that we can bring into the discussions with people who are frustrated with the state of the environment is the alignment of the capitalist state with the corporate class. The understanding that the ecological problems we face are the world being reordered in the interests of minority power and wealth. You will find, excuse my pun, very fertile ecological ground for those arguments. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much. Get well.
Socialism or extinction, just to get it straight in the eyes. Ian is going to sum up now, and then, that's it.
Right, lovely, brilliant, fantastic debate and discussion. Thank you very much, and thanks for bringing food in especially, because that's what I do to promote agroecology. And everybody wants to know about agroecology. Agroecology is the production of food as and with nature. Simple as that, but with people. Very high labour, very intensive production. Just wonderful. Anyway, disillusionment. Don't be disillusioned. Don't. Just don't, because that's what they want us to. They want us to give up. If we give up, they'll be fine with that. Remember the kind of Marxist truism. The seeds of future society are sown in the present. Okay, so what you decide to do in your studies and everything else, when they're joined the struggle and not just seen as abstract kind of mirror gazing, are profoundly important. Okay, so don't become disillusioned. But there's loads of really good work to be done. Okay. What I want to do, there's some pretty good points and I can't address it. What I want to do is give an example of what it's like to be a revolutionary socialist in a campaign. Okay? I apologise for this bit. I don't like to blow my own trumpet. I don't even like trumpets. I want to talk about fatalism and I want to talk about principles. And what happens when, as a revolutionary socialist, you're involved in a campaign, where you bring those qualities into a campaign, and what that does to mainstream environmentalism, and what it does to promote meaningful victory. Okay? This is a map. Remember when maps were on paper? Okay, so this is a map. It's taken from an A to Z road map. And it's around Newport, which is just south Wales. And there's a little, these are the motorways, and there's a little blue dotted line. And that was a plan to build an M4 relief road around Newport. And it was going to be built through some of the most important habitats in Wales. This whole area that runs from Chepstow to Cardiff is wonderful. And it's wonderful not because it's like natural, but it's because the bloody Romans drained it and they produced this massive area of wetlands. There are between, depending on what satellite data you use, 900 and 5,000 miles of waterways running across that small area. It is every single ditch is a rich soup of life. It's had 2,000 years to generate. We call them the rainforests of Wales, which confused the hell out of the media because there's no trees. But we were talking about their biodiversity. Now that was under threat. And what the mainstream does is it gathers a campaign and it takes the campaign into the politicians. And unfortunately for them in this case, I was the person with my revolutionary socialism who went into those debates. So I sat opposite a minister in Wales, behind closed doors, and they said, well, it is true that this is going to be a devastating project. It is true that we can't compensate for it. What we'd quite like to do is maybe offer you something. You know, maybe some land, some grass. I mean, if we talk about the details, that's where we really got into discussions. No! No! Absolutely not. This is a unique landscape. The communities that are there are proud of it, and they're the active managers of that landscape. The organisation I've been working with have been in those communities for 50 years. Why the hell would I sell them and those habitats down the river for some promise of what? Offsetting? Some extra money for a petty bourgeois NGO? No. So we went from there. We went into the public inquiry. Anybody been inside a public inquiry? They are bourgeois hellholes. Hellholes. They have QCs, KCs, wherever they are, these expensive lawyers. One of them came up to me and was complaining, you know, I've only got a very small lobster license in my second home in West Wales. He bloody regretted that later. Right? Now, the point is, we went back to the community and we decided we would stitch the campaign all the way along. They're not going to knock us out. Today we'll do biodiversity, tomorrow we'll do transport, the next day we'll do climate change. No. A complete campaign, environmental in every respect, socio-ecological, right? We were supposed to do a public inquiry for 6 months. We held the buggers down for 18 months. It cost them 140 million quid. It cost us 32 rand. Right? When it comes to the disparity of arms between ourselves and the ruling class over the environment, we have got what they have not got. Principles. Principles. And radical optimism. Not the pessimistic optimism of academic Marxists. Radical optimism. If we stand and if we fight and we do it with communities, we will win. And we won! This map that they produce with such confidence, this roadmap, this motorway will be built. No! It has not been built. And you know, when they announced it in the Senate and the Welsh Parliament, because the planning inspector said, build it. And we worked like hell on the Labour Party and everybody else to make sure they knew what they were going to lose. When they announced it, I just sat up in the Senate in the public thing. I couldn't feel my bloody legs. Victory! How often do we feel that? Christ, how did Lenin and Trotsky feel they must have been stoned? I couldn't feel my legs. Based on principles, based on radical optimism, rejecting fatalism. That is fatalism. When the buggers put it on a map and tell you what year it's going to be built, and you reject it. Comrades, I did that because I had travelled from misanthropic environmentalism, watching David Attenborough and hoping everybody stopped breathing, or maybe got a war, all the way through to revolutionary socialism where I stand today. And they didn't know they'd have a Bolshevik in the room. It's a small story, it's a trifle story, but it hints at where we need to go. Do not underestimate the radical optimism that you, as revolutionary socialists, can inject into environmental struggle. We are heading, Alex is here, into the age of catastrophe, where we are no longer just talking about saving, preventing, but living in the world that's corrupted by capitalism's ecology. Join the SWP.